if there you go. So it's already live. Um, yeah, it looks like we're on. Okay, again, we want to welcome you to Symposiac's vodcast, and what we're going to discuss today is probably something that is should be interesting to people who are interested in Christian apologetics. Okay, we're going to talk about naturalism, um, and uh, I was just telling Lawrence before we started the vodcast that uh, it looks like what we do here at in our for our vodcast seem to capture the kind of vision that I have for our church symposia. And again, Lawrence is a Catholic, so he's not part of symposia, but he's actually a co-host of the vodcast. Um, but I just think that what we're doing here seem to reflect the kind of vision that I have for the church, and that is, that's what the name symposia stands for, is intellectual or gatherings with intellectual conversations. With food and drinks as well, but of course, probably one of these days, we'll probably just bring food and drinks, right? And then we can just Lawrence and I can just eat and drink while we're doing the podcast, right? So, but this pretty much capture the very core of what it is I'm trying to do with Symposia. And because that's what the name stands for, gathering with intellectual conversations. And that's what we do here. I think the vodcast evolved in such a way that it ended up being more informal and impromptu. And it's more about conversation. So it's not something that we rehearsed. There's not, we don't really, we didn't really put a lot of, preparation time. We didn't use a lot of preparation time. But this is more like a conversation that you guys can listen to. You can listen to us having conversation about intellectual matters. And I think that's probably what makes this somewhat, in a way, exciting for me, right, as one of the hosts of this vodcast. And so, Lawrence, before I say something about naturalism here, you wanted to say something first?
Um, yeah, sure. I've appreciated our episodes or topics over the last year or so. It's been informative for myself. But in all honesty, that learning is the secondary thing to building a relationship. I think with other individuals, in the faith, and so I think the primary goal for me has been is to develop this relationship between Pastor June and myself,
Mm-hmm.
because that ultimately that's what's interests me.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know who's out there. I don't know who's watching us. The 5,000 views that I see, they're numbers, right? And The only thing I would like to say is, if you are watching and you're regularly watching, interact, right? And so that's if your reason for participating here is to learn, I'm surely you have questions, right? And so the only way you're going to um, get those questions answered is if you ask the ones that triggered the question, right? And if that's us, then we're all ears, or eyes, I should say. We'll read your question and we'll try our best to respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, Lawrence has a background in apologetics, Catholic apologetics. I don't have much of a background in apologetics. My background is more in philosophy. But I taught an apologetics course at Asia Pacific Theological Seminary a few years ago, right, in the Philippines. And so that's probably probably my background in apologetics. I'm not a big fan of apologetics, but if you are interested in apologetics, so you might find this conversation interesting. Okay. So let me begin by saying something about naturalism, trying to point out some of the arguments. Now, the goal is not really to give you ready-made answers to the objections coming or the arguments coming from naturalists. But this is more like to inform you, to give you an idea, about the kind of discussions and debates that are going on between naturalism and theism. Okay, I think that's the goal that I have in mind, at least, is just to inform you what naturalism is, in what sense it is some kind of a critique of belief in God, right? And let's look at some of the responses as well. Okay. Now, many of the things I'll say here is probably are probably more informed by some of the things I read from Michael Roos, professor of philosophy at Florida State, who's a naturalist, and also informed by some of the things I read from Alvin Plantinga, who is a professor of philosophy at University of Notre Dame, a Christian philosopher. Okay, so let me just give you some definitions here. Naturalism is the view that um, everything in the universe, at least in theory, right, should be explainable in ways as if there's no God, right? So this is pretty much what scientists do. Every time they try to explain something about the universe or some events in the universe, there's always this assumption that God is not involved in the causal processes that brought about whatever event they are actually investigating. And that's the reason why naturalism is the philosophy that is widely accepted by scientists and philosophers. And I think it's safe to say that scientists are naturalists of some sort, right? All of them are naturalists of some sort. They investigate what's happening in the world without assuming that God even exists. Okay, they think that everything that is happening naturalistically. Now, some naturalists are methodological naturalists, meaning they simply use the method of science to actually account for what's going on in the universe without necessarily assuming that there's a God. So, a methodological naturalist is not really saying that there is no God, but a methodological naturalist is someone who explains what's going on in the world, right, as if there is no God, right? And then you need to contrast that with what we call metaphysical naturalist. Metaphysical naturalists, on the other hand, are actually atheists. So they're the ones who actually claim that there's nothing above and beyond the universe. The only thing that exists is just the universe itself, right? So that means there's no such thing as God that actually exists above and beyond the universe. So that's a metaphysical naturalist. So again, a methodological naturalist is someone who believes that when you try to explain what's going on in the world, you have to explain it as if there is no God, and you purely use the scientific method to account for what's happening. A metaphysical naturalist, on the other hand, will say that this is the only thing that we need to that this is the only thing that actually exists, right? The universe. There's nothing above and beyond it. Okay. There's no God, right? So that's naturalism. And like what I said, the reason why it is important for Christians to familiarize themselves with naturalism, it's because naturalism is the primary philosophical view of scientists and philosophers. Okay, and that's the reason why when you actually look at many college students, or even probably high school students who are familiar or who are actually involved in churches, that sometimes they leave the church because they cannot really connect what they learn from the church and what they learn in school, right? So if you go to university, of course you will learn the sciences from a naturalist perspective. And then on the other hand, when you actually go to church, right, of course the pastor will talk about the universe as if there is a God that actually governs whatever it is that is actually happening in the universe. And so you get these conflicting explanations. And for some people, that's actually enough to actually make them leave the church. Okay, and that's why in survey after survey, it appears that many young people are actually led away from the church, right? As they encounter naturalism, right, in school. And again, you can't blame the school for actually embracing naturalism. Of course, it's going to try to explain everything as if there's no God, because it's not part of the assumptions of the academia that there is a God that needs to be explained, or that God is involved in whatever causal processes, right, that we find in nature. Okay, so I hope I explained it well, right? And I know, Lawrence, if you wanted to say something, I'm gonna pause right here before I present, probably some of the basic arguments for naturalism.
I might have more to say if once we get into the arguments.
Mhm.
I do think though that naturalism, as described just now, um, from my perspective, from a Catholic perspective, I would say it's just part of the picture, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes you can make do and do what you need to do, whatever your goals are in life, with partial explanations. And I'll call it partial explanations because I don't think it has the full picture, right? And so you can still operate and be successful and do what you need to do with partial information. We do it all the time. So I have no problem, I guess, with a someone who just kind of goes about the world with a naturalistic framework. They don't have the faith. They don't have the faith, and I can't engage every single person I encounter that doesn't have the faith, and use apologetics to try to bring them to the faith. I think there's other things operating there. When you have to make the decision, where are you going to spread the seed of faith, right? And I guess from my experience, it just seems to me that if God wills for someone to be moved by some kind of thing I can help with, God will place that person in my sphere of influence somehow.
Mhm.
And if it was just random folks I just meet on the street that want to debate me on atheism versus theism, I don't feel that's necessarily always the best use of my time. So I guess we can get right into the arguments. That
Yeah.
way, I might have something more
Yeah.
substantial to say.
Yeah, but again, that's why I said the goal is not really to figure out how giving people ready-made defense of the faith, right? Because I think what is important for Christians is to understand first, the views of the opponent. Okay, and that's probably the goal that I have today, right? Is to understand where these people are coming from, those people with some kind of a naturalistic perspective. So here's the basic argument for naturalism. Okay, the basic argument goes like this. Okay, the goal of like methodological naturalism, or the use of scientific method, is to actually acquire knowledge. Right, that's a goal. And somehow through the use of the scientific method, we literally acquire knowledge, right? We want to make the plane fly, right? And we're able to do it, right? And when I say we, we're talking about humans. We wanted to connect with people on the other side of our planet through a telephone. Yes, we were able to figure that out. So that means, right, the scientific method, it looks like it actually works. Okay, and it's been working for about 400 years, 400, 500 years, like when you look at the history of the sciences. So the scientific method works. Like, so again, the goal for the use of the scientific method is to acquire knowledge of reality of the world. And somehow we seem to think that it actually works, right? We wanted to cure an illness. Somebody came up with whatever medication, and it works, right? And so, for naturalists, there's no reason for us to actually doubt the sciences. Why? Because given that it's been working, right, for this long, okay. You see the advancement in medicine, you see the advancement in technology, and all of those are testimonies, right, of how the scientific method is actually a really good method for acquiring knowledge of reality. Okay, and so that's pretty much the argument. Okay. And so if you are a theist, one thing you might want to say is that there might be things in the world that the scientific method will not be able to explain. So if you make that claim, then of course probably the burden of proof will be on us Christians, right? To come up with So if you want to deny that everything in the world can actually be inquired about, right? Or that it is within the scope of scientific inquiries. Okay, if you say that, right, then um, then what you need to do is to figure out a way how to point out what are the things that science cannot seemingly explain. Okay, and of course, some people might say, what about miracles? Miracles cannot really, science cannot really explain those miraculous events. But the problem with actually using that as a response to naturalist is that you have to somehow give some kind of really decent proof, right, that actual miracles occurred. Now, I'm not denying that there are actual miracles, but we know, if you've been in church for a long time, that that is actually one of the most difficult thing to actually defend, right? That an actual miracle took place. Okay. So that might not be a promising move, although for some people it might be. Okay. But that might not be a promising move if you're talking to a naturalist. Now, some people might use, what about intelligent design, right? There are things in the world, in the universe, that seem to be intelligently designed. Some people will actually make those kind of claims. But of course, a naturalist might say, whatever it is that you consider to be intelligently designed can actually be explained by natural selection, evolution by natural selection. It looks like evolution by natural selection will be enough, right? To actually accomplish that. Accomplish the process of giving explanations, right? And so, for example, some naturalists might say, no, let's look at the human eye. Usually, we use the human eye as an example of something that is designed, right, by God, or that it requires that there must be someone who must have initially designed it. But evolution by natural selection will say, no, the reason why we have the eyes that we have now is just because of natural selection, right? As humans evolved, somehow some humans developed better eyesight, right? And those with better eyesight ended up, increasing their chances of surviving because they can detect, predators. They can figure out, easily where to find food. And so, in some sense, because they are the fittest to survive, they ended up surviving. They ended up increasing their likelihood of survival. Okay. And then, of course, out of all those early humans with a more developed eyesight, some of them probably ended up with a much more developed eyesight. And they're the ones who increased their chances of surviving. And they ended up surviving, most of them, right? And, of course, as it develops, at some point we ended up with the eyes that we have now. Okay. So the point is that at least naturalists will say, it looks like um, natural selection has an explanatory power, right, to account for what's actually happening here, or for what happened here, why we ended up with the eyes that we have now. Okay. I don't know. You wanted to say something before I continue with some other examples here?
I think the intelligent design
Mm-hmm.
um, use of the eye
Mm-hmm.
is not in dispute with natural selection, that an eye can can become more and more fine tuned
Mm-hmm.
because of natural selection. I think the issue they would say is it's not that eyes are getting better; it's that the eye came to be to begin with. Because if you come from, the sort of the Big Bang theory, single-celled organism is the first life, right? Amoeba, whatever it's called, right? It's a single-celled organism. It becomes multiple-celled organism. I mean, those organisms didn't have eyes. If evolution is true, at some point an eye had to be created. The eye is not just a thing; it's made of component parts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how did those component parts, right? Those component parts are essential to the function of the eye. And I'm not a biologist person, right? So
Mm-hmm.
somebody's probably going to correct me, but the eye is made up of component parts in and of themselves or separately. They have no function, or they have no, I suppose they have no meaning until they come together and function together to make the eye work. So how did those component parts that make up the eye actually come together? I think that's a little harder to imagine for me, who is not an expert in biology. It's harder for me to imagine an explanation of how those things, by natural selection, somehow came together to form an eye to begin with. I can imagine how the eye can get better as time goes on. You could see further distances because you can see predators at a larger. I can conceptualize the reasons why an eye could get better and you could see further, but I can't, in my imagination, think of how those component parts come together to make an eye to begin with.
Okay.
I think that's the only thing I want to say.
No, no. I think that will lead me to the next point here, right? Because some people will actually object to naturalism and say that there are actually certain things, right, that natural selection cannot really explain. Here's an example. How did at some point in the process of evolution, right, at the initial stage, a non-living thing must have become a living thing, right? And I think this is consistent with what you're actually saying here, right? How did that even come about? Because even until today, evolution doesn't have a way of actually explaining that, or at least biology, right, has no way of explaining how a non-living thing at some point in the process of evolution ended up becoming a living thing, right? Of course, naturalists might say, oh, yeah, we cannot really answer that, but it doesn't mean that you have to resort to religion, right, to account for it, right? Probably there are just certain things that we might not really know, given that probably the earliest life emerged somewhere in the deepest part of the ocean, right? Or it's possible that it probably emerged right in the mouth of a erupting volcano, right? Who knows, right? This might be things that we will not be able to actually figure out. So the claim is that at least um, this is something that natural selection should not be able to, right, explain, right? And I think that's consistent with what you're saying here, like how the different components of the eye, right, even how they came together, right? um, you know, and so that might be this might be a problem, for naturalists, but naturalists will just simply say, the fact that we cannot know it doesn't mean that religion has a better way of explaining it, right? Because what religion will do is just simply tell us, oh, it's just God who created it, right? As if that doesn't have explanatory power at all, right? At least from the standpoint of naturalist. Um, or some people might say, what about those irreducibly complex, right? Things in, let's say, the human body. I don't know. I think the examples that they used would be, the blood clotting cascade, right? Where after you get a cut, it heals itself, right? That looks like that seems to be. It looks like it must have been designed, right? In some sense, at least in the eyes of some people. I'm saying this in very very broadly, okay? Because I'm not gonna deal with the details because it's gonna take us forever here. Or some people will say, what about the bacterial flagellum? You probably heard of this, right? The bacterial flagellum. It's like a propeller. It's an appendage to a cell, right? And what it does, it attaches itself to a cell, right? And it moves the cell from one place to the next. And it has some kind of a propeller. It looks like a propeller, right? And some people say, that when you actually look at that, that must have been somehow designed because it looks like natural selection cannot account for how something like that can even come about, right? It's working like a machine, right, inside our body. Okay, so some people will use that, right? But of course, we know that some of those examples in biology are discredited by some people, by many biologists already, right? And so that's the reason why that might not be a powerful thing to say, right, in response to naturalists. So some naturalists might say that there are other things that science cannot seem to explain. What is that? Science cannot seem to explain free will, if there's such a thing, right? That would be beyond the scope of what science can actually study. Or some people might say, what about consciousness, right? Consciousness might be beyond, right, the scope of what science can actually study. What about morality? Right? Morality can be, the seeming objectivity of morality must be elusive, that must have made morality elusive from the standpoint of science, right? Am I making sense with all these examples here? I don't know. You wanted to say something? I'll let you say something here if you have something in mind.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, there's lots of things that science. Well, presuming, just say for the sake of argument, God exists. I mean, if you were to talk to some atheists, they would be like agnostic atheists, right? So they said they would say they can't prove that God does not exist. So they're open to the possibility. They're just waiting for a good argument or a good explanation for why there's a God, and they might be open to believing in it. So they don't know for sure, right? So I would say, for the sake of argument, let's say there is a God. Can your naturalistic scientific method or whatever, can that even be used as a way of determining, anything about this God that exists outside of this physical world? Assuming God is of some other kind of, realm or something like that, and the answer is no. So even if God did exist, your method of trying to understand anything about that creature is inadequate right out the gate, because it studies the physical world. If God is not of the physical world, then you can't use it to study it anyway. So, I mean, that's what I would have that's what I would say to a person that's sort of puts themselves in this box of.
But
I don't know.
but
I
but
don't
of
know.
course,
There's probably an answer to that, but
mhm.
I'll deal with it when the person says something like that.
Yeah, but of course, a naturalist might say, well, why even assume that there is a God, right?
because he
Um,
might exist. So I'm just saying it's possible.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
if they're willing to say it's possible, then their method won't help either of us
But
gain any perspective about that creature, that being.
yeah,
Why assume there is no God? I mean, we could have those questions till the end.
no, but of
Cows
course,
come home.
a naturalist might say, we don't have to assume that there is a God if we can explain what's happening in the world, right, from a purely naturalistic standpoint, right? That's why we're trying to we have to find, right, something about reality, about the world, right, that probably science might not be able to explain. Just like in order to account for the very possibility of God,
Well,
right?
that's not. I'm sorry, that's not good enough for me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's say you're a child, right? Let's
Mm-hmm.
say I'm going to use an analogy here.
Mm-hmm.
The child has a certain limit. If you go with like Piaget's understanding of cognitive development, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we all know from observation, whether you believe Piaget was accurate or not, young children don't have a very robust understanding of how the world works. They have a very tangible, like, their sense of reality is what my senses tell me, right? So if their senses tell them, a certain, if you show them a magic trick, for them that's reality, right? So they, how they understand the universe is is just kind of from their experience, from their natural experience, right? And if you were to tell that child, well, you know, or if you just say that child is okay just being in that state, and they don't have to question, they don't have to wonder possibilities of another way of understanding the universe, then they're going to be stunted. You're already stopping them from developing any further. As we all know, as adults, you develop even further. You have a better understanding of how the world works. Morality is not black and white; it's a little gray sometimes. That kind of a thing. And so I think it's the same thing for an adult who's like keeping themselves, from my perspective, keeping themselves from a perspective of a child and saying, well, you don't need to think about anything beyond the natural world. Just keep it in the way you understand how the world works, just sort of naturally. I feel like it's just the same kind of a thing. You're just kind of boxing yourself in this perspective. I have no I, if they were to challenge me and say, why do you assume God exists? I was like, well, I just do. I mean, I don't need to prove anything to you. I mean, if you want to know, I could tell you, but
But I think it's a legitimate concern, right?
well, not to
You know,
me. For them, maybe
yeah,
they're
no,
the
no, it's a
ones
legitimate
struggling. They're
concern
they're
to
the ones
say,
struggling with it.
no, no,
It-
it's a legitimate concern to ask, right? Why should one even consider the possibility of God, right? When there's nothing in the world that should require, right, such assumption, right? Why even assume that, right? Or why even consider that possibility? How come can I just simply wonder about the possibility of the flying spaghetti monster? Right. Of course, Bobby would say, but that might be absurd, right, for anybody to even consider that as a possibility. But what's the difference between, having a concern for the possibility of the flying spaghetti monster, right, and having a concern for the very possibility of God, right? At least I'm trying to capture, where the naturalists are coming from here, right? It
so
looks like.
so so if you lived in a village
Mm-hmm.
that just, everything's fine. The village has been operating for centuries upon centuries, maybe millennia upon millennia,
Mm-hmm.
right? The children are fed, the wives are clothed, or there's a roof over their heads. They have no need. They have no, if that's what we're saying, they have no need to wonder about anything beyond the realm of of the forest. And we're even discovering some of these tribes that have never seen, right, in the, I don't know if you've heard the stories, right? They haven't, in South America, or they haven't ever seen any human person outside of their, I mean, I just feel like that's like, is that the explanation? Like, why? Well, let's not explain. Let's not wonder anything beyond, because there's no need for those people. Why do they? What do they care about Netflix? What do they care
Yeah,
about
but
civilization?
but I think you are probably using the word need, right, in a different way here, right? Um, when I was using the word need, because probably there's something here that you just cannot explain, right? Of course, when
Right.
you all of your needs are met, but that's a probably that might be an equivocation there, right? Because that might be a different kind of need. If you have food to eat, if you have shelter for a roof over your head, right? Those are different kind of need. Well, when I say it's the need that is somehow um, forced upon us, right? Because there's something about reality that needs to be explained, right? Uh, so for example, just like the examples I was using a while ago. So when you look at free will, so if we freely deliberate, right, in actually making choices, right? Is there something there that needs to be explained? Because if there's such a thing as free will, there must be some kind of a self that is above and beyond the natural world, right? Because if it is not above and beyond the natural world, then it is governed by the same laws, right, that govern the natural world. So it's not going to be free, right? In order for there to be such a thing as free will, there has to be something above and beyond the natural world that is actually making the choices, like such as the self, right? The self cannot just simply be reduced to the brain, right? Because it looks like in order for it to be free, right, there must be some aspect of it that is not governed or controlled by the natural processes, right?
Right.
And
So
so and so
most naturalists are determinists, aren't they?
most of them will be compatibilist, right? When it comes to free will, so they will think that what they'll do is that they will redefine what freedom means, right? The freedom will simply mean an action or something that is not coerced, something like that, right? So 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 a person who behaves morally because he or she was trained to behave that way, right, is still praiseworthy or blameworthy, right, for whatever it is that they do. On the other hand, someone who was hypnotized to perform an act, right, will not be counted as praiseworthy or blameworthy because the person was somehow coerced to do it. So the fact that my actions or my behaviors are determined by something else, right, does not necessarily make my act not free, right? But it can still be free because acting freely simply means acting in a way that is not coerced. So that's how they were gonna. That's how at least many compatibilists seem to redefine the word freedom, right? And so that's why for naturalists, there's seemingly not there's no problem, right, with free will if you define it from that compatibilist view, right? The only reason why it becomes a problem if you have this libertarian view of free will, right, where somehow freedom has something to do with like some kind of a self that is independent of the world and making choices, right, for an individual. And only in that sense that's going to become a problem, right? Um, and so and so at least for some naturalists, they'll think, free will is not really a problem if you think that it's compatible with determinism, right? Or probably even when you look at consciousness, might not even be a problem because probably consciousness really has something to do with the brain, right? You know, things that we do to the brain can affect our mental states. So that means there must be some kind of a connection between the two, right? So some people will say, you explain what's happening in the brain, and that should be enough to actually explain what we refer to as consciousness, right? Um, or some people might say, um, morality can also be explained like evolutionarily, right? Probably, nice people have tendencies to survive, and that's the reason why, naturally, they will prefer, right, things that are moral rather than things that are immoral, because that is actually conducive to their survival, right? So some people will say that's the reason why we believe in objectivity of morality, because there are just certain things that we discover about how the natural world works, right, that is actually conducive to our survival, right? Certain values, certain principles that if we follow them, somehow they're conducive to, attainment of, I don't know, some kind of common good, right? And so that's why we naturally will end up preferring those things, because they're much more fitting for this process of surviving, right? So at least naturalists are claiming there are ways to explain free will, consciousness, right, morality, in a purely naturalistic way. That one does not need to assume that there is a God. Okay, so I don't know. That's at least how what they argue about, right? Or that's at least the nature of their argument. That things that are previously assumed as elusive from the standpoint of the sciences are probably not really elusive, right? Because there are probably ways to explain them scientifically or naturalistically. So that in a way will weaken, right, the need to assume that there is a God, given that those things have some kind of evolutionary, biological, neurological explanation, right? Or yeah, psychological explanations. Okay, so so that's the nature of the responses that people give. But before we end this, I wanted to say a few things about what Plantinga said about naturalism, because that seems to be the one that seemed to have gained a lot of attention, at least among philosophers, right? Because Plantinga, are you familiar with Alvin Plantinga? You heard of the name?
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like this philosopher from Notre Dame, who is a Christian philosopher. Is actually an evangelical philosopher. Is considered to be probably one of the top philosophers of religion, right, of the 20th century. And I think that's probably correct to say that. Um,
We actually have a question in the chat.
okay.
I don't know if you see it.
No, I don't see it. Let me
He's
just check.
is a friend of mine. I think it was a little bit a while ago, but he did ask a question. If a naturalist is going to make a believable claim
Uh-huh.
that it can explain everything in terms of naturalism, then surely they should have an explanation for what knowledge, Latin scientia, is. What is knowledge according to naturalism?
Okay. So I hope James is still listening to us, and I'm gonna try to. So what is knowledge? Um, um, Knowledge, at least, I'm trying to think of um, how a naturalist might respond to that. Probably one way for naturalists to respond to that is that knowledge is simply beliefs that are um, formed by some reliable belief formation processes, right? And so at least some people will define knowledge in that way. So knowledge is a belief that is actually formed through some reliable belief formation process. At least the reliabilist will actually have that kind of conception of knowledge. What that means will be, there are reliable and unreliable belief formation processes. For example, uh, relying on my memory, right? Memory or knowledge that you have acquired based on remembering, right, might be reliable, especially if I'm just simply trying to figure out, let's say, what I ate for lunch today. I can, I can tell that, that would be a reliable belief formation process. I can say I ate a sandwich for lunch today. But if you'll ask me what I ate 2 weeks ago, probably my memory will not be as reliable, right? Another reliable belief formation process would be, inferring correctly a conclusion from true premises. That will be considered to be a reliable belief formation process. Another one will be probably standard perceptual experience. So, for example, the fact that I'm looking at my computer right now, or my laptop, right, and I'm not drunk, I'm not on drugs, right? As far as I can tell, I'm not hallucinating, right? And so I can justifiably claim, right, that it looks like I'm having an experience of actually seeing my laptop, right? So, so the point is there must be some cognitive processes that seem to be reliable enough, right, to give us knowledge, and any kind of belief that is actually acquired through reliable belief formation processes will be counted as knowledge, right? So so knowledge, at least for some people, right, has something to do with that. I'm just thinking here that that way of explaining knowledge might be compatible with naturalist. But there's also, um, if James is familiar with philosophy, let's say, you probably remember, you probably know something about, let's say, Quine, a 20th century philosopher from Harvard, who argued for the naturalization of epistemology, right? That he thinks that knowledge um, should be um, placed, right, within the scope of what psychologists can actually study, right? Psychologist, brain scientist, right? So what will count as knowledge, right, will have something to do with how our brains operate. Um, they call it the naturalization of epistemology. So that might be compatible, right, with that might be compatible with naturalism.
So
Go
is
ahead.
knowledge is like cells in the brain that contains electrical signals just kind of firing. I mean,
Again, it.
because
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question necessarily, but if what he's asking is if naturalism is the idea that everything that we can think of that exists is reducible or explicable through sort of natural processes that you then something abstract like knowledge is explicable through you know figuring out what's in the brain that's containing that information, I guess you could say,
Yeah, and it
right?
might be, of
Because
course.
if your explanation is ideas, then ideas themselves are not. It's a. It's not a tangible thing, right? An idea is not a.
Again, it's controversial, right? Whether it is a tangible thing or not. It might be reducible to some activity in the brain, right? Or reducible to an event in the brain. There must be a corresponding brain activity when I believe that there are two bottles of Gatorade right in front of me, right? Uh,
But
so
there
there
must
must be
not be.
something in my brain that represents the two-ness of the bottles, right?
Right.
That I recognize them as Gatorade bottles, right? And I recognize them as somehow being in front of my, my eyes, right? That's why I can see them. And so the claim is that, if you want to account for knowledge, that's just what knowledge is, right? Some kind of probably again, it depends on. It's also controversial what you can what one mean by belief, right? For some people, belief is just some kind of a mental representation, right? And if that mental representation corresponds with reality, right, then you can account for knowledge in that way. Um, but of course, it's much more complicated than that. I'm simply pointing out that there's a possible way for naturalists to account for knowledge, right? Um,
But when you say mental representation,
mhm.
again, that's an abstract thing.
It doesn't have to
What
be.
what what is the
Mhm.
thing that is holding that mental rep? What is the thing? I think that's
Yeah, no. Again, like
what
what I
the
said,
question
if you
is.
claim that it is reducible to your brain, right? There's just something that is happening in your brain when you're having a belief X or whatever it is that you're believing in, right? Whatever belief that you have, there must be something in your brain that is somehow capturing that,
But
right?
isn't it, what? How is that different from someone who believes in a soul, and
Mm-hmm.
then someone says, "Well, why do you have to believe in a soul?" Right? You can just think of natural explanation, but then what I'm hearing, and I know I don't think you're a naturalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're trying to convey what they're trying to say. I would say, well, you're saying there must be something that does the thing, but you're not showing me, you're not proving it to me. You're just saying there must be,
No,
in
no,
the
no.
same way, in
It
some
can be. Of
way,
course, it
someone
can be
says there's a soul.
proven, right? Because if I hook up your head to some brain imaging devices, I might be able to explain or observe, right, certain brain activity that correspond to a certain belief that you have, right? So I might
What
be
do you
able to
mean, right?
determine that you believe in God, right, by I don't know, by checking out your I don't know temporal lobe, right, and see what's going on there. That might explain why you have some kind of a belief in God, right?
But you don't actually know that right now, do you? You don't actually know that that's how you can account for it.
No, no, that's a possible way of accounting for it. You might not accept it, but the point is there's a naturalistic way of probably explaining that. So, for example, if I observe what's happening in your temporal lobe, if I observe what's happening in the temporal lobe of other people, and you guys happen to share very similar beliefs, right? So there might be a way of accounting for whatever beliefs that you guys have just by looking at what's going on in your brain, right? So,
Yeah, maybe.
so that's of course you will have to identify that for each belief that one has, right?
I mean, I don't
Uh,
know. How do you know that? You look at brain waves and you say, "Well, look at how do you know
mhm,
you're? I'm thinking of an elephant, and the other one's thinking of a flower just by brain waves. I mean, you don't.
mhm.
I just we're just not there. We're just not there yet. I mean, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Even the science is just not
But the
there.
fact that even if we are not there yet, right? But at least in theory, there's a way to conceive of the possible way of explaining knowledge, right, from a naturalistic standpoint. That's the thing, right? So if you wanted to be purely naturalistic about it, right, then you will have it has something to do with what's going on in the brain, right?
Yeah.
That's the way to naturalistically explain knowledge, right? So, for example, there are people who, after getting some, brain damage, right, they ended up being good in math, right? So that means, being talented in intuiting, right, mathematical truths might have something to do with one's brain. Because there are seemingly examples of people after gaining some after getting damage in the brain, right? It enabled them to actually understand math in a more heightened sense, right? Different from normal people. Okay, so that might, or for example, there might be a way to explain why people will believe politically partisan claims, right? By actually looking at one's psychology or something like that, right? Probably people who are much more, people who prefer authoritarian father figure, let's say, right? Um, might have tendencies, right, to believe Republican claims, right? Um, so probably the psychology or whatever's going on in the brain, right, will have a way of explaining, why one believes a belief, whatever belief that may be, right? So,
Yeah, in
so, so,
theory, sure.
so the claim is that naturalist has, seems to have, right, a capacity to explain a lot of things. Okay. And I was going to talk about Plantinga's objection here, but I think we probably, yeah, we did it for an hour. But what I can say is that let me just summarize. So instead of explaining Plantinga's objection, I'll just summarize the argument given by naturalist here, right? So the claim that they want to make is that if you can already explain everything as if there is no God, then why then assume that there is one, right? So the claim is that there's no need to assume. So if you can explain, at least in theory, just like what I was doing a while ago, I was trying to describe how a naturalist might view knowledge, right? Uh, um, So if one can actually, at least in theory, right, conceive of possible ways to explain things, right, naturalistically, so why then suppose that there is a God? So naturalists might say, you might have. So the option for someone who's only a methodological naturalist is that either the person believes in theism or believes in metaphysical naturalism, which is equal to atheism, right? And what would be the option for the theist? So either they become either fundamentalist or conservative, or they become liberal moderate, let's say, right? But a naturalist might say, you know what, there's something seemingly absurd about fundamentalism, conservative, let's say conservative Christianity, right? So go for probably liberal moderate view. But why go for liberal moderate view if you can actually already explain everything as if there's no God, right? It looks like it's not necessary for anyone to go take that route, right? And so the claim is that a methodological naturalist, in the end, should be metaphysical naturalist, right? You that the claim is that you might as well go all out, right, all the way, right, and just rejecting anything that exists outside of our universe, right? And so I think that's just a summarized version of some kind of a argument for naturalism, and I think for us Christians, I think that sometimes it might not be necessary for us to come up with responses, right? But probably what we need to do first is to understand where these people are coming from, right? And I think understanding where they're coming from, and that's why in the past we had interviews with atheists, right? And that was my goal. My goal is not to have a debate with them, right? The goal is to make people of symposia, people who watch us, right, um, to understand where the opponents are coming from, right? Where the people who are against Christianity are coming from. Because I think there's something liberating about that, right? It makes us more modest about our claims, right? And I think it encourages more critical thinking for us to consider their views as um, seemingly reasonable, right? And that we need to grapple with that, with the reasonability of their views, right? And then hopefully, by struggling to figure out how to respond to them, that it changes us, right? It makes us intellectually humble, right? It pushes us to be more intellectually honest, right? About what it is that we believe. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much my goal, right? And my goal is that by exposing people to the arguments of atheist and naturalist, I'm hoping that that will actually change us, right, as Christians, in shaping our intellectual virtues, right? Um, that we take those challenges seriously, and that we are forced to actually inquire and figure out for ourselves, right? How should we actually legitimize or justify, our acts of believing God, our church, the doctrines of the church, right? Um, Now, I'm not claiming that if you cannot approve any of them, that you should not believe them. Um, I think there are times when there probably no way to prove things. But we have to be humble enough to recognize that we just cannot prove it, right? That we are making certain assumptions, even if we don't have any legitimate reason for doing so. Um, and hopefully that will prevent us from, what do you call this? Um, just being lured to believe something based on confirmation bias, right? Um, and I think that's probably the essence or part of the essence of the progressive faith that I seem to embrace. I know Lawrence is much more traditional than me, right? That you can have a life with God, a life with Christ, right? Even with all these uncertainties, right? Um, that one should not pursue theological certitude, right? Just to justify one's belief, because for the most part, many things in life you cannot really be certain, um, and there are times when you just have to make that leap of faith, right? I don't know. I will give you the last word. Okay, if you want to say something.
Sure.
Uh,
I'm just going to be pretty blunt about this, only
mm,
because this is truly what I would say to someone who have this conversation with me. I'd say, if you're if you're a naturalist and what you're trying to sell me is you don't need God, naturalism answers it all, I would just say your product is not convincing me to buy it, right? So,
mm,
think of the late night television things, and it's like, oh, it chops this, it does this, it does this, and you're like, maybe, and that's not all. Oh, okay, maybe, and then and that's not all. Okay, then you're trying to sell me something. Naturalism doesn't have anything to offer me, and the reason why that is, and this is my appeal to those who are kind of on the fence, like they might not have studied the issues, so they're afraid of talking to naturalists or atheists. I would just say, don't be afraid, have the conversation, maybe you'll learn something. But
mhm,
what I would say is, from what I've heard of naturalism, if naturalism is true science, it explains everything in a natural way, I'm all for it. I don't disagree with most of what science is offering me. I might doubt some things that aren't like proven, truly proven, right? But a lot of the examples were psychological, sociological, the soft sciences. I totally agree with all those things, right? So what I'm saying is, you can be a Christian and take everything that naturalism is explaining is claiming to explain about the world in a natural way. You can accept all that. What I'm saying is, Christianity, and I'm representing Catholicism in particular, is all that plus a way to explain all the little things that science has not explained yet. And if that's the God of the gaps, so be it. I don't really care what Richard Dawkins says. It has explanatory power for me. It helps me get through my day. It helps me get through my life, because science might not answer some of those gaps in my lifetime. So I guess back what I was saying earlier. I have nothing against what naturalism explains through the scientific process if it does it legitimately and it's consistent and it's been proven and everybody in the field agrees with it. Fine, I'll accept it. But what Christianity offers is all that plus an understanding of human personality, an understanding of consciousness. It has theories to explain consciousness, soul, spirituality, this kind of connection that we seem to have with other people, even across oceans. We just have this sense of connectedness that science cannot explain at this moment. Yeah, could it explain it later? What? Sure, why not? But it doesn't explain it now, and it doesn't explain consciousness now, and it doesn't explain free will now. I have tons of books from atheists about free will. Most of them don't believe in it, right? And they don't all agree either. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a selling point to Christianity. It's naturalism plus other theories that may or may not be true, but at least gives you some sense of comfort that there is some answer to it. Is it necessary? Well, maybe not. But is it meaningful to you? Does it give you a way of moving forward? And I think that's what it has to offer. And maybe it ends up not being true, whatever, but I think it's at least a bonus to naturalism.
Yeah, for me, actually, I know I said you're going to have the last word, but I just wanted to express this. Um, Theologically, I don't really have a problem with naturalism. I think the world operates independently of God. But I think God occasionally intervenes, right, in human affairs. I think that's what I'm trying to figure out how that works. Probably God intervenes in our consciousness, right, by revealing something to us. And probably consciousness is really not reducible to physical things. It might be some kind of an emergent property that arises based on what's happening in the brain, but it has some kind of an independent existence, and it has probably causal powers, right? So probably that's where God really revealed things to us. So God can be revealing something in our consciousness while the universe is just operating on its own. So that's why I say I don't have a problem naturalist explaining everything scientifically, because I don't think that disproves the claim that there is a God. It might just be the case that God is operating independently of what's happening in the universe, right? Um, and that's something that I'm trying to develop right now, right? I'm trying to see whether there's a way to explain that. I'm trying to review some of the things I've learned about Hegel and stuff like that, and hopefully I find something, right?
Well,
We'll
let
see.
me fine tune what I said earlier.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that the thing I would disagree with naturalism is that the ism part, because it's just naturalism, it's just the natural. So it excludes the supernatural, the above
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
nature.
yeah. No, no,
That's the problem I
that's a
have
good
with
point.
it.
That's a good point.
So there's a book out there, Scientism and Secularism, by
Sorry.
J.P. Moreland,
Yeah.
who's a local philosopher, right?
Biola. Talbot.
Biola.
Talbot.
So I read maybe the first third of the book. I mean, I get the gist of it. The point of it is it's not about Christians being against science. Most of the progress in the sciences over the centuries have been from Christians. They're not somehow they're not they're not mutually exclusive, right? A lot of them were monks, even priests. So it's not mutually exclusive. So it's not the science that Christianity has an issue with at times. It's a scientism or the naturalism, because it already excludes the possibility of anything we believe in, or at least classical Christianity. I mean, even things that you would believe in a soul, naturalism would reject the soul because it's not right. I can't imagine them accepting the existence of something ethereal, something out there that's not reducible to atoms, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so even things that a ORT theologian would accept, I think naturalists would reject. So somehow you just got to draw the line and say it can't be the ism.
Mm-hmm. No,
Are there natural? I can't even think of anything that the natural sciences have posited that Christianity has to say it can't be that, right? Because there are even theistic evolutionists. I'm not a theistic evolutionist, but they exist, right? So so what is it that science has produced? A theory, a theorem, or a law, or whatever? What have they produced that a Christian is now saying, oh, these are incompatible? I can't think of anything. I mean, some people will say it's evolution. Um, and maybe that's a debate for another issue, but
yeah, yeah.
for another day.
But
But
then
I can't
again,
think of
yeah.
anything that has been indisputably proven by science that Christians are like, no, I don't believe in gravity. I don't believe in natural. Natural selection is macro microevolution, right? Maybe I'm getting my terms wrong or my prefixes wrong. It's just you know you have a red-headed parent and then you have a brown-haired, and then somehow you get a mix of the different genetics, right? That's just no, nobody disagrees with that kind of stuff, that kind of evolution. But
Yeah,
there are Christians who disagree that a monkey eventually becomes a human at some point. You know,
but yeah, but that might be mischaracterization, right? It's not like the monkey becoming human.
well, no,
Uh,
the monkey doesn't become a human
yeah,
through a
yeah, yeah.
gradual process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Punctuated equal, whatever it's called.
Mm-hmm.
That uh, Darwin posited, right? There's just this leap forward at times.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that's a theory, right? So did it actually happen? I don't. It's a nice explanation, but I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you could actually prove it.
Yeah, and again, I think the fact that there are bona fide Christian scientists, right? I'm not talking about followers of Christian Science, right? That we're a religious group, but
Okay.
actual, like legitimate Christian, legitimate scientists who are Christians. I think that shows that science and religion are not as incompatible as what Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss might portray. Okay, so I think militant atheism, right, is wrongheaded, right? Given that there are legitimate scientists who are Christians, right? So again, thank you for watching us here. I hope you guys learned something from just listening to our conversation. And again, I think I'm happy with how the vodcast evolved. Right, it evolved into impromptu, informal conversations, and I think people eavesdropping, right, in our conversation should at least incidentally like learn things. Okay, and I hope that that will contribute to your intellectual growth, and not just intellectual growth, but when you grow intellectually, I'm hoping that it will also lead to spiritual growth as well, right? And again, thank you. I always want to thank Lawrence for just giving us an hour or two of his time per week just to do this, and I think it makes it much more effective when when I discuss things with someone who doesn't have the same view as what I have, right? And I don't think we're it's not like we're drastically different, but there's like of course some significant differences, right? And I think it's better like that. And again, for those of you who are watching, I think what Lawrence and I accomplished through this vodcast is that we're able to show that people with two different competing beliefs, right, can still manage to civilly discuss things, right? So, because sometimes I will have Facebook friends who will unfriend me, right? Because they just don't agree with what I was saying. And I think that's like a little weird when people do those things. They cannot seem to tolerate, right, that other people have different views. And so I think what Lawrence and I have shown here is that having a civil discourse about controversial things, right, is actually possible. And so even among people from with different with competing perspectives, and so at least that, right, if you at least learn that by after watching us, right, I think that should be revolutionary, right? It should actually be transformative, right, in relation to how you live your life. And so again, I just wanted to thank you guys for watching. God bless you, and see you next week. Bye.